cycle through this again, shall we? So, psychic healers, I've seen an aura reader myself in the past, how I got into skepticism myself. I started with the Australian Skeptics, a very large organisation in Australia, obviously, and I just contacted them going back about 14 years ago, and I said, I'd love to be part of your movement, and how can I help out? And they said, well, I spoke with the editor of the magazine that we run, and he said, oh, there's nothing you can do. I work from out of my bedroom, so unless you want to come in and be my secretary or something. So they didn't have anything for me to do, and I was very despondent. And then about 10 minutes later, I got a phone call from their person named Harry Edwards, who was an investigator for them. And he said, well, actually, I'm looking for someone to be a bit of a guinea pig for me. I'm very well known when I try to investigate claims to the paranormal. Everyone knows who I am. Sort of like James Randi in this country, I guess. And so he said, I'm looking for someone to go and visit a number of alternative practitioners and to assess and evaluate their claims. So I was sent around to an iridologist and to an aura reader, to a naturopath and to a homeopath and various other alternative practitioners. And they did diagnoses of conditions they claimed that I had. Then I went and saw an orthodox doctor who ran a gamut of tests on me to see if their claims were correct, and none of them were correct in any way. So they made lots of very general claims about my health. Some said that I had a thyroid condition, which is a favourite of Sylvia Brown, if you ever see her readings. Some said that I had problems with my liver. Others would talk about psychological problems, which may or may not be true. But basically, they all made claims about the state of my health and a series of blood tests and other tests. One said I had scoliosis, which is curvature of the spine, and they were all inaccurate, so they were all incorrect. And that was just for my very first investigation. I've done many since then. So, psychic healers, I think, are a dangerous kind of psychic. And then finally, in this list, I've got psychic financial advisors. If you go to an article that I did for Skeptic Society, for their e-Skeptic newsletter, there's a link there. I did an article called Paranormal Wall Street, and that is an article about how psychics are taking advantage of the current economic crisis that's taking place globally. Cashing in on that, and the financial risks that they pose. And I present a number of examples of why these people are dangerous. And so 2 examples that I cite was one fellow who was managing funds for a company, a banker, and he lost $7.7 billion on advice that was provided to him by psychics. So it was called a high-risk strategy in their euphemistic speech. And then there was a company in Australia too, which I remember, called OneTel, and that was owned by the Murdoch and Packer heirs. And that company went bust after they'd injected about $100,000 into feng shui. So they had they integrated feng shui principles into their the layout of their offices, and still went bust, or perhaps because of that. So, how do skeptics explain psychic abilities? I'm noticing no one's asking. Thank you. Question, yes?
Before you move on from this taxonomy, there's one thing that we're blissfully, at least in this country, free of, and that is, let's say something like psychic helpers that would help the police department predict who was going to commit a crime and have them committed before it happens. We could, there, but for the grace of God, we would have psychics riding around in police cars, stopping at houses and arresting people before they committed crimes, or pulling over cars before they sped, or
outside of Arizona.
Yeah, maybe I was thinking of Arizona. Yeah.
So, are you telling me that this is actually happening?
No, I'm saying that interestingly, there's a an open niche that somebody.
We'll keep this within the room. We'll contain it here, so no one gets any ideas.
So you should apply for a commission for the first guy that does it.
So I did an interview with Bob Carroll. I don't know if any of you heard about the point of inquiry going back a couple of weeks ago, and a wonderful thing that he does with his, or he previously did with his students, was to invite them to invent a paranormal practice or a pseudoscientific practice to teach these kids, or these young adults, how these things can be created, how easily they can be constructed. And so he was telling me, I said, well, what are some of the interesting concepts that your students came up with? And he said, well, one came up with something called colour therapy. And I said, well, actually, I've got a colour therapist down the street from where I live in Santa Fe, so this actually does exist. So I guess, Ian, you might come up with that, so that perhaps it does exist on some level somewhere. But please, everyone, do feel free to ask questions as we go along. I hope I'm not intimidating anyone here. So, how do skeptics explain psychic abilities? So, one quote here, no psychics are psychics, but some are even less psychic than others. I'm not claiming that any of them are psychic at all. So, self-deception. I think that there are some people who do believe that they have abilities. Yes, sir?
Just to the question of, using quotation marks around psychic and saying alleged, that does speak to the question of definitions. If we define it as a real thing, then every time we refer to a psychic, we have to, somehow qualify that. Can you speak to that? The language we use, the cautionary language as to whether it's a real ability or not. You just said no psychics are psychic.
Well, I think that's amongst this group here that I'm sort of having that caveat, I guess, by saying I'm using this term loosely. I don't believe that this exists as a concept. I mean, it does exist as a concept to people. I don't believe that it exists as an ability in the way that it's touted.
But how do we effectively communicate that to non-skeptics?
I think every time that you treat that, I guess you need to qualify it in there. So it depends on the instance that you're talking about. But when you're discussing psychics with people, I guess you need to, more than just using simple words or one word, I think you need to try and get that across that in your understanding, psychic abilities don't exist. They can be replicated, recreated by magicians, which is what I'm just about to go into. So it is, I think, something you need to treat on an individual level. So whenever you're talking about it with someone, you need to just raise questions and apply critical thinking and encourage other people to apply critical thinking to the way they perceive these people and their claims. So psychics, there isn't any evidence in all of the studies that have been undertaken to suggest that psychic powers do exist in the way that they're claimed, and they can be replicated by magicians very competently. So are these people mistaking personable skills of interpersonal skills in some way? I think a lot of this comes down to socialization, and in much the same way where people might be raised in a family where they have a belief in some sort of religion. I think people can be raised to believe that psychics do exist, psychic powers do exist, and that is a normal thing for them in that frame. So I think that if you're raised in a family where psychics, where maybe your grandmother claims she has psychic abilities and it's a gift that's passed on, it's some sort of hereditary thing, then you're more liable to believe that exists. So then to look at how do skeptics explain psychic abilities. The other side of the coin, so I guess there's self-deceptions that people can lead themselves to believe in psychics, or there can be deception at hand. So we're talking about magic, or are we talking about maliciousness here? So with conjurers, we've got magicians and mentalists and people who deliberately deceive. So if we go and see a performance of a magician, then we know that we're about to be deceived. We're prepared for that. So these people don't claim to have psychic abilities, but they can replicate psychic abilities. And then we've got con artists on the other side of the coin. So these are people who are often magicians, but they don't label themselves as magicians. So, for example, Uri Geller, he used to label himself as a psychic, he used to call himself a psychic, and now he refers to himself as an entertainer instead. So the picture I've got here is from a friend of mine who's an archaeologist. He did a dig in a place called Kern County recently, and so he sent this image to me and he said he's proof that Uri Geller has been to Kern County.